On March 22, 2008, a 61-year-old farmer named Howard Telsch stood in the service bay at Graves Equipment, a Case IH dealership in Ellsworth, Kansas, looking at his 2006 Case IH Puma 165 that had been sitting there for 4 days. The tractor had 1,840 hours on it. The hydraulic system had failed during spring wheat planting the previous week, losing all pressure while pulling a 40-foot drill across his northeast section. Howard had called the dealership immediately, described the symptoms, and brought the machine in that afternoon. The service manager had told him they'd diagnose it by Monday and have it back to him by Wednesday at the latest. It was now Saturday. Howard had driven the 19 miles from his farm to check on the repair. The dealership was closed, but through the bay window he could see his Puma still sitting in the same position it had been in 4 days earlier, untouched. He walked back to his truck and drove home without the tractor, calculating in his head what 4 lost planting days meant to his spring wheat window. The call came Monday morning at 7:15. The service manager, a man named Glenn Merrick, who'd been with Graves Equipment for 9 years, told Howard the hydraulic pump had failed and that the failure was caused by contaminated fluid. Customer neglect, not covered under warranty. Howard asked what kind of contamination. Glenn said it didn't matter. The warranty didn't cover operator error. Howard said he'd used Case IH approved hydraulic fluid exclusively since he'd bought the machine in April 2006, had changed it on schedule, had kept every receipt. Glenn said the fluid currently in the system tested outside specification. The repair would cost $9,200 in parts and labor. Howard asked if he could see the test results. Glenn said they were internal documentation. Howard asked if he could inspect the failed pump. Glenn said it had already been removed from the tractor. Howard said he wanted it back then, wanted to take it to an independent mechanic for evaluation. Glenn said that wasn't how warranty denials worked. The pump stayed with the dealership. Howard could either pay for the repair or pick up the tractor as is. Howard said he'd think about it and hung up. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time that morning, looking out the window at his equipment shed where the Puma should have been. His wife, Dorothy, poured coffee and sat across from him without saying anything, because 38 years of marriage had taught her when to wait. Finally, Howard said, "They're saying I contaminated the hydraulic fluid." And Dorothy said, "Did you?" And Howard said, "No." And Dorothy said, "Can you prove it?" And Howard looked at her and said, "I kept every service record, every fluid change, every filter replacement, all of it documented with their own receipts from their own service department." And Dorothy said, "And they won't look at it." And Howard said, "They won't look at it." If you've been farming long enough to remember when a warranty meant something, when a dealership stood behind the equipment they sold, and when a handshake with your service manager carried more weight than fine print, then you understand what this story is really about. It's not about one hydraulic pump or one $9,200 repair bill. It's about what happens when trust breaks quietly and the people who witnessed it start making decisions you don't see until it's already too late. We're telling these stories because they matter, because the choices made in dealership offices shape what happens in the fields for years afterward, and because rural communities are built on memory that doesn't forget and doesn't forgive when someone breaks their word. If that kind of farming is what you remember or what you're trying to protect, consider subscribing. These stories take time to research and tell accurately. Howard Telsch had been farming 940 acres of wheat and milo in Ellsworth County since 1979. He owned 640 of those acres outright, paid off by 1998 through careful management and years when margins were thin but consistent. The other 300 he leased from a retired school teacher named Mildred Kern, who'd inherited the ground from her father and had been renting it to Howard since 1985. Howard ran a modest operation. No hired help except during harvest. His wife kept the books and drove the grain truck. His son had left for trade work in Wichita in 1996 and never came back to farm. Howard had been buying Case IH equipment since 1981, not out of brand loyalty but out of proximity to Graves Equipment, which sat 19 miles from his farm on Highway 156. When something broke, he could get parts the same day. When he needed service, they came out or he brought it in and the work got done without drama. He wasn't a big customer. He bought used when he could. He traded up only when something wore out completely. But he paid his bills on time, never asked for extended credit, and never brought equipment back with problems he'd caused himself. In April 2006, he'd traded a worn-out Case IH MX-180 toward a newer Puma 165, not new, but newer, with 340 hours on it. He'd financed $68,000 over 5 years at 7.2% through Case IH credit. The payments were manageable. The tractor had run well for the first 2 seasons. The hydraulic failure in March 2008 was the first mechanical issue he'd had with it. Howard called Glenn Merrick back on Tuesday morning and said he wanted to speak with the dealership owner. Glenn said the owner, a man named Frank Graves, whose father had started the dealership in 1964, agreed with the warranty denial. Howard said he wanted to hear that directly. Glenn said Frank was out of town until Thursday. Howard said he'd wait. Frank Graves called Thursday afternoon at 3:20. Howard was in his shop when the phone rang. Frank said Glenn had explained the situation and that the dealership's position was firm. The hydraulic pump failure was caused by contaminated fluid, which indicated operator neglect, and Case IH warranty policies didn't cover neglect. Howard said he had 2 years of service records, showing he'd maintained the tractor exclusively through Graves Equipment's service department, that their technicians had performed every fluid service, and that he'd used only Case IH-approved hydraulic fluid. Frank said the fluid currently in the system tested outside specification, and that the contamination must have occurred between the last service and the failure. Howard asked when the last service had been. Frank said November 2007. Howard said that was 4 months and 290 hours ago, and in that time the tractor had been running in his fields, doing exactly what it was designed to do. Frank said something had introduced contamination into the system. Howard said, or your technician used the wrong fluid in November. And there was a pause on Frank's end of the call that lasted long enough to mean something. Then Frank said, we stand by our technicians' work, Howard. And Howard said, then stand by your warranty. And Frank said, I'm offering you a compromise. We'll cover $4,000 of the repair cost as a goodwill gesture. You pay the remaining $5,200. And Howard said, Frank, your technician most likely caused the problem I'm being charged to fix. And Frank said, I can't prove that, and you can't prove it didn't happen in your operation. And Howard said, can you prove it did? And Frank said, nothing. And Howard said, I'll pay the full $9,200 under protest, and I want my tractor back by Monday. And Frank said, we'll have it ready. He paid the $9,200 on Monday, March 31st, when he picked up the Puma from Graves Equipment. Paid it with a check from the farm operating account, and took the receipt and the warranty denial letter. A single typed page with no technical details, just the words contaminated fluid, operator neglect, claim denied, stamped across the bottom. He put the letter in the filing cabinet in his office and drove the tractor home and finished his spring wheat planting across the remaining days of a window that had been compressed by the 9 days the machine had sat at the dealership. By April 12th, the planting was complete, and Howard was sitting at his kitchen table with the warranty denial letter in front of him and the $9,200 receipt beside it, and the service records from Graves Equipment beneath that. 2 years of documented maintenance, every fluid change recorded in their system, every filter replacement signed off by their technicians. Howard looked at the documents for a long time and then called Case IH's customer service number and spoke with a representative who listened to the account of the warranty denial and said she would escalate it to a regional review team. The regional call came on April 21st from a man named Dennis Kellerman, who had reviewed the case and was prepared to offer Howard a goodwill credit of $2,500 toward future Case IH parts or service purchases. Howard said the warranty denial had cost him $9,200 on a machine he'd maintained exclusively through the authorized dealer network. Dennis said he understood Howard's frustration. Howard said he wasn't frustrated, he was accounting, and there was a difference. Dennis said the goodwill credit represented Case IH's recognition that the service experience had fallen below standards. Howard said it represented $2,500 against $9,200. Dennis said it was the maximum authorization available at his level. Howard asked if there was a level above that. Dennis said there was a corporate escalation process. Howard said he wanted to escalate. The corporate call came on April 29th from a woman named Patricia Eldridge, who had reviewed the full case file and was prepared to offer Howard a goodwill credit of $4,000 toward a future Case IH equipment purchase. Howard said he'd bought a $68,000 tractor and maintained it through the authorized dealer for 2 years, and the dealer had most likely serviced it incorrectly and then denied the warranty claim on the basis of that incorrect service. Patricia said Case IH was not in a position to confirm the contamination originated with dealer service. Howard said, "Are you in a position to confirm it didn't?" Patricia said the investigation had been inconclusive. Howard said Frank Graves had told him the same thing. Patricia said the $4,000 goodwill credit was the maximum authorization available at the corporate level. Howard asked if there was a level above that. Patricia said not for cases of this type. Howard said, "Then I want to make sure I understand. Case IH's final position is a $4,000 credit toward future purchases from a company that just charged me $9,200 to repair damage most likely caused by their own authorized dealer." Patricia said, "That is our offer, Mr. Telsch." Howard said, "Thank you for your time," and hung up. That was the last call Howard Telsch ever made to Case IH about anything. He filed the corporate response letter with the other documents and went out to his equipment shed and stood looking at his 3 Case IH machines in the evening light. The Puma 165, a 1998 Case IH 2388 combine, and an older utility tractor he used for feeding cattle in winter. He looked at them for a long time with the expression Dorothy had learned to recognize over 38 years as the expression of a man who had completed an accounting and was reading the result. Then he went inside and said to Dorothy, "I'm done with them." And Dorothy said, "All 3 machines?" And Howard said, "All of them." And Dorothy said, "This isn't anger talking." And Howard said, "No, this is arithmetic." Howard didn't tell anyone what had happened. He didn't post about it. He didn't call neighbors. He just quietly listed all 3 Case IH machines for sale through a farm equipment dealer in Salina who handled the transactions without questions. The combine sold in June for $41,000. The Puma sold in July for $54,000. The utility tractor sold in August for $8,200. Howard used the money to buy used equipment from other brands at auctions across Kansas that summer. He replaced the Case IH machines with machines that worked and that carried no memory of March 2008. But other people had been paying attention. 17 farmers had been in Graves' equipment between March 18th and March 22nd, 2008. Some picking up parts, some dropping off equipment, some just stopping by. They'd seen Howard's Puma sitting in the service bay, untouched for 4 days. They'd heard Glenn Merrick on the phone talking about contaminated fluid and warranty denials. They'd watched Howard leave without his tractor. And when word started spreading in late April that Howard had sold all his Case IH equipment and wasn't buying Case IH replacements, those 17 farmers started asking questions. One of them was a 57-year-old farmer named Clayton Voss, who ran 1,100 acres northwest of Ellsworth. Clayton had been buying from Graves' equipment since 1989. He had a Case IH Magnum 215 and a 23366 combine. He'd been in the dealership on March 20th picking up filters when he saw Howard's Puma in the bay. In May, Clayton saw Howard driving a different tractor in the field, not the Puma, and not Case IH. Clayton asked around. He learned about the warranty denial. He learned about the $9,200 repair bill. He learned that Howard had escalated to corporate and been offered $4,000 in goodwill credit and had refused it and sold everything. Clayton didn't say anything about it to anyone outside his family. But in June, his Magnum 215 developed a hydraulic leak. Not a failure, just a leak. Clayton called Graves' equipment and scheduled service. The leak was fixed in 2 days. The cost was $340. But when Glenn Merrick asked if Clayton wanted to look at the new Magnum 305s on the lot, Clayton said no. Glenn asked if there was a reason. Clayton said, "Just not right now." 3 weeks later, Clayton traded his Magnum 215 and his 23-66 combine toward different brand equipment at a dealership in Great Bend. Total trade-in value, $127,000. Graves Equipment lost the sale without knowing why Clayton left. The second farmer to leave was named Eugene Talbert. He was 63 years old. He farmed 820 acres and had been a Graves Equipment customer since 1984. Eugene had heard about Howard's situation from a man at the co-op. Eugene didn't know Howard personally, but he knew the story. A 61-year-old farmer with documented service records, a warranty denial with no technical explanation, parts disposed of before inspection, a $9,200 bill. In July, Eugene's 2005 Case IH MX210 needed transmission service. Routine maintenance, nothing major. Eugene brought it to Graves Equipment. The work was done correctly. The cost was $890. But when the service was complete, and Glenn Merrick mentioned that Eugene's combine was getting older, Eugene said he'd think about it. In August, Eugene sold his MX210 and his 2188 combine privately and bought replacement equipment from a dealer in Russell. He never called Graves Equipment to explain. He just stopped coming in. By September 2008, Graves Equipment had lost 3 long-term customers. Frank Graves noticed the drop in service appointments and mentioned it to Glenn Merrick. Glenn said it was probably just the economy. Commodity prices had started falling. Wheat was down. Credit was tightening. Frank accepted that explanation and didn't look deeper. But the departures continued. By November, 5 more farmers had left. Not all at once, not dramatically. They just stopped bringing equipment in for service. They stopped calling about parts. They stopped showing up to look at new inventory. And when Glenn called to follow up on trade-in opportunities or service reminders, the answer was always the same. We're good. We'll call if we need anything. And they never called. The farmers who left didn't organize. They didn't meet. They didn't coordinate. But they talked to each other the way farmers talk, in brief conversations at the grain elevator, at the co-op, in the parts aisle of the farm supply store. One farmer would mention that he'd heard about Howard Telsch. Another farmer would say he'd heard the same thing. A third would say he'd been thinking about switching dealers anyway. And within 6 weeks of each conversation, equipment that had been serviced at Graves Equipment for years started showing up at dealerships in Great Bend, Russell, Salina, and Hayes. By March 2009, exactly 1 year after Howard's warranty denial, Graves Equipment had lost 11 long-term customers. These weren't young farmers experimenting with brands. These were men in their 50s and 60s who had been loyal to Case IH for 15 to 25 years. Men who had financed equipment through Case IH credit. Men who bought parts exclusively from Graves Equipment. And they were leaving without explanation. Frank Graves called a staff meeting in April 2009 and asked what was happening. Glenn Merrick said he'd noticed the customer drop-off but didn't have an explanation. The parts manager said he'd heard some complaints about warranty issues, but nothing specific. Frank said every dealership dealt with warranty disputes. Glenn asked if they should reach out to the customers who'd left. Frank said if they wanted to leave, let them. There were always other customers, but there weren't other customers. Not enough to replace what was being lost. By June 2009, Graves Equipment's service revenue was down 28% compared to the previous year. Parts sales were down 19%. New equipment sales were flat, but used trade-ins had dropped by nearly half. In August 2009, a farmer named Roy Heston brought his Case IH Puma 195 into Graves Equipment with a failing alternator. The tractor had 980 hours on it. It was still under warranty. Glenn Merrick looked at it and said the alternator failure was caused by belt tension issues. Operator error. Not covered. Roy had been maintaining that tractor himself, following the manual exactly. He asked to see the documentation of the belt problem. Glenn said the mechanic's assessment was sufficient. The repair cost $640. Roy paid it. Then he called Clayton Voss. Clayton told Roy what had happened to Howard Telsch. Roy said he'd heard something about it, but didn't know the details. Clayton laid it out, the timeline, the warranty denial, the $9,200, the corporate escalation, the $4,000 offer. Howard selling everything. Roy listened and said, "How many others left?" Clayton said, "At least 11 that I know of." Roy said, "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Clayton said, "Nobody's organizing anything, Roy. People are just making their own decisions." Roy traded his Puma 19.5 and his 2588 combine in September 2009. Graves Equipment lost $94,000 in potential trade-in value. Roy didn't explain why. By December 2009, Graves Equipment had lost 14 long-term customers. Frank Graves hired a consultant to analyze customer retention. The consultant interviewed 9 former customers. 6 of them mentioned warranty disputes. 4 of them specifically mentioned Howard Telch's case. The consultant's report recommended revising the warranty claim process, improving documentation standards, and offering cost sharing on disputed repairs. Frank read the report and filed it. He didn't implement any of the recommendations. In February 2010, Case IH Corporate sent a territory representative to review Graves Equipment's performance. The representative noted declining sales, poor customer retention rates, and multiple informal complaints that had reached corporate through back channels. In May 2010, the representative returned and informed Frank that Case IH was concerned about the dealership's service practices and customer relations. Frank said the economy was responsible for the downturn. The representative said other dealers in the territory weren't experiencing similar declines. By August 2010, Graves Equipment had lost 18 customers. Service revenue was down 41% from March 2008 levels. The dealership was operating at a loss. Frank Graves took out a business loan to cover operating expenses and told himself the situation would stabilize. It didn't. In November 2010, Case IH pulled Graves Equipment's franchise agreement. The official reason given was failure to meet minimum sales thresholds and customer service standards. Frank tried to negotiate. He offered to attend dealer training. He offered to hire a new service manager. Case IH declined. The franchise termination was final. Graves Equipment closed in January 2011. The building was sold to an auto repair chain. The inventory was liquidated at auction. Glenn Merrick took a job at a farm supply store in Hutchinson. Frank Graves retired. The closest Case IH dealer to Ellsworth was now 47 miles away in Great Bend. Howard Telch heard about the closure in February 2011. Dorothy told him one morning while they were having coffee. She'd heard it from a neighbor. Howard didn't say anything. He just nodded and went out to work. That evening, Dorothy asked him if he felt vindicated. Howard said no. Dorothy asked what he felt. Howard said, "I feel like 18 farms lost their closest dealer because one service manager wouldn't admit a mistake." Of the 18 farmers who left Graves Equipment between March 2008 and November 2010, 16 of them are still farming. 14 of them have never purchased another Case IH machine. 4 of them eventually return to Case IH Equipment but buy from dealers in other counties. None of them have ever done business with any dealership Frank Graves or Glenn Merrick were associated with. Howard Telch is 77 years old now. He still farms 940 acres. Howard runs equipment from 3 different brands. None of it is Case IH. When people ask him why, he doesn't tell the full story. He just says he switched dealers years ago and it worked out fine. But in his filing cabinet in his office, there's still a manila folder. Inside it are the $9,200 receipt from March 31st, 2008, the warranty denial letter with contaminated fluid, operator neglect, claim denied stamped across the bottom, the service records from Graves Equipment showing 2 years of dealer-performed maintenance, the corporate response letters from Dennis Kellerman and Patricia Eldridge, and a newspaper clipping from February 2011 announcing the closure of Graves Equipment after 47 years in business. Howard has never shown that folder to anyone except Dorothy, but he's never thrown it away either, because the folder isn't about anger, it's not about vindication, it's about the accounting. And the accounting says that a dealership chose to save $5,200 on a disputed warranty claim in March 2008, and that decision cost them 18 customers, $740,000 in trade-in value, and a franchise that had been operating since 1964. The 2006 Case IH Puma 165 that started it all is still running. It was sold to a farmer in Nebraska in July 2008. That farmer put 4,000 hours on it and sold it in 2014. The second owner put another 3,800 hours on it and traded it in 2019. The hydraulic pump that was replaced in March 2008 has never failed again. Glenn Merrick retired in 2018. He never worked in farm equipment again. Frank Graves died in 2021. His obituary mentioned that he'd owned Graves equipment for 31 years and had been a pillar of the Ellsworth business community. It did not mention the closure. Clayton Voss still farms. He's 73 now. When younger farmers ask him for advice about choosing a dealer, he tells them the same thing every time. Find someone who'll admit when they're wrong, because everybody makes mistakes, but only honest people own them. Roy Heston still farms 640 acres. He's never bought another Case IH machine. When his son asked him why in 2017, Roy told him the story. The son said, "That was 9 years ago. You're still holding a grudge?" Roy said, "It's not a grudge, it's a decision, and decisions don't expire just because time passes." In 2019, a farm equipment journalist researching dealer closures contacted Howard and asked if he'd be willing to discuss why he'd left Case IH in 2008. Howard said no. The journalist asked if it was related to Graves Equipment's closure. Howard said he didn't want to comment. The journalist asked if he'd ever consider returning to Case IH. Howard said, "I'm 72 years old. I'll be farming maybe 5 more years, so no." The journalist asked one more question. "Do you think what happened to Graves Equipment was fair?" Howard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Fair isn't the right word. Inevitable is. When you tell a customer his maintenance records don't matter and his service history doesn't count and the parts are already thrown away so he can't verify anything, you're telling him he doesn't matter. And when you tell enough people they don't matter, eventually they believe you. And then they leave, and then you close. That's not fair or unfair. That's just arithmetic." The folder is still in Howard's filing cabinet. Dorothy asked him once in 2016 why he kept it. Howard said, "Because someday someone might need to know what it costs to save $5,200. That day hasn't come yet, but the folder is still there, and Howard is still farming, and Graves Equipment is still closed. And 18 farmers who watched what happened in March 2008 are still making decisions based on what they saw." The story ended the day Glenn Merrick told Howard Telsch that contaminated fluid wasn't covered and the parts were already gone. Everything after that was just consequences arriving on schedule.